What if I told you that Prince Harry's scream wasn't just anger, it was fear? Real, bone-deep fear. The kind that erupts only when a man suddenly realizes the world he's been fighting against is about to move on without him. That is exactly what happened the moment Buckingham Palace sent out a discreet but world-shifting message. A message announcing a new monarchy, a new power structure, and yes, a new leader. And that leader wasn't King Charles. It was Prince William. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now, imagine for a moment the tension in the Montecito mansion at that exact second. The sun barely rising, phones buzzing on counters, reporters setting alarms for royal alerts. And in the middle of all that quiet, all that soft California calm, one notification shatters everything. Because for the first time in modern royal history, the palace signaled a transition so abrupt, so blunt, and so symbolic that even those inside the royal household admit they were stunned. But the person who reacted the most violently, emotionally, verbally, and almost physically? Prince Harry. And the scream he let out. Well, it wasn't the scream of a wronged son. It was the scream of a man who suddenly realized he wasn't just being pushed aside. He was being erased. Before we get deeper into that moment, the moment that insiders are already calling the Montecito meltdown, let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone fight so hard to tear something down, only to completely fall apart when that thing finally moves on without them? It's ironic, isn't it? Harry and Meghan have spent years insisting the monarchy should modernize, democratize, decentralize. Yet when Buckingham Palace finally took a major step toward reinvention, their reaction wasn't triumph. It was panic. Pure, unfiltered panic. And what was worse, the announcement wasn't even public at first. The version the world saw was carefully phrased, diplomatic, and stripped of all the parts that caused the screaming. The real version, the one that was sent privately to senior royals, advisors, and select members of the institution, contained a blueprint, a structure, a redistribution of duties and authority that shifted the center of gravity straight toward William, and straight away from Harry. If that sounds dramatic, you're absolutely right. But this isn't just palace theater. This is the monarchy reacting to an unprecedented crisis. Years of scandal, a fractured family, public mistrust, leaks, accusations, lawsuits, media wars, and the catastrophic distance between two brothers who once promised they would never let anything come between them. And yet, here we are. So why did this matter now, in this exact moment? Because Buckingham Palace has been holding back. They've been patient. Too patient, some would argue. While Harry leveled accusations from across the Atlantic, while Meghan built a global brand around her version of events, while documentaries, interviews, books, and podcasts painted the monarchy as archaic and oppressive, the palace stayed silent. Strategically silent. Painfully silent. Almost suspiciously silent. But silence is not the same as weakness. And this announcement, this quiet but earth-shattering restructuring, was the first real sign that something inside Buckingham Palace finally snapped. And that is why this moment is so important. This isn't just Harry screaming. This is the monarchy drawing a line in the sand. Now let's talk about that scream for a moment. Because it wasn't just anger. Sources say it was a layered sound. Rage mixed with disbelief, mixed with something dangerously close to betrayal. And why wouldn't he feel betrayed? For years he has insisted he was forced out, that he was undervalued, unheard, unprotected. But if all of that is true, then why would losing even more influence hurt this badly? Here's something to think about. Sometimes the loudest voice accusing others of betrayal is the one most afraid of being left behind. And whether you agree with Harry or not, there is one truth you cannot deny. This announcement didn't just threaten his status in the family. It threatened his entire narrative. Because if Prince William becomes the face of a new monarchy, a modern, stable, strategic monarchy, where does Harry fit? Where does Meghan's brand fit? Where does their entire public campaign fit? Nowhere. And that is the scariest part for them. But don't worry, we are not revealing the entire palace announcement yet. Not its wording, not the unedited line that set this whole firestorm ablaze, and certainly not the name that turned Harry white with panic. We'll get there. For now, let's rewind just slightly to the atmosphere inside the palace leading up to this moment. Imagine the hushed conversations, advisors stepping into rooms with files tucked under their arms, Whispered updates between senior staff. The weight of responsibility pressing against the walls. The future of the monarchy being debated behind doors thicker than bank vaults. And within those walls, two men shaped the future. William, rising. Harry, shrinking. But you shouldn't assume this was all about favoritism or punishment. No, this was about survival. The monarchy has survived wars, scandals, abdications, assassinations, and global geopolitical shifts. But the modern world? Social media warfare? Documentary-driven reputational collapse? These require a different kind of leadership, sharp, steady, diplomatic, transparent, cautious. And whether people like Harry or not, he has not been that. Not for a while. Meanwhile, William has increasingly become the quiet anchor of the family, the one stepping into public crises, stabilizing appearances, projecting continuity. He is not flashy. He is not dramatic. He does not scream. He does not leak. He does not panic. He plans. He waits. He chooses the right moment. And this announcement was that moment. Now, imagine how that feels when you're Harry. Imagine realizing that the brother you once teased, tackled, and confided in is now being shaped into something else, something powerful, something formidable, something inevitable. Imagine seeing your own relevance slip away while your sibling becomes the central figure in an institution you abandoned. And now imagine the palace officially confirming it. Of course, Harry screamed. But wait, there's more. Because the announcement wasn't just about William stepping up. It wasn't just about Harry stepping down. It wasn't just about Charles stepping back. There was something else. Something hidden in the fine print. Something that lies at the center of this story. Something that explains why Harry's reaction was so explosive, so visceral, so uncontrollable that palace insiders reportedly exchanged stunned messages about it for hours afterward. And that something is coming. But before we reveal the line that changed everything, we need to talk about the moment the message actually reached Harry. And this part is almost cinematic. Picture Harry in the kitchen, phone buzzing. Meghan across the room, watching. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. 4. He reads the message once. Then again. Then his face changes. His posture changes. His breathing changes. A quiet moment turns into a storm. Why? Because Harry didn't just read an announcement. He read a verdict. A verdict on his choices. A verdict on his loyalty. A verdict on his future. And the scream? It was the sound of a man realizing the monarchy no longer needed him. And possibly never did. But let me ask you something. If you were Harry, if you were someone who walked away, burned bridges, and then watched those bridges being rebuilt without you, would you feel anger? Would you feel fear? Would you feel regret? Or would you feel all of them at once? Hold that thought. Because everything you feel right now, every question forming in your mind, every emotional reaction rising in your chest, that's exactly where this story begins to take its darkest turn. And trust me, what comes next changes everything. Because the announcement wasn't complete. The public version was the safe version. The private version, the one that makes Harry scream make sense, is the one we're about to dive into. But before we do, let me leave you with this. The monarchy didn't just make a decision. It made a declaration. A declaration that Prince William would not only take the lead, but that Harry would no longer be part of the future they were building. And as you're about to see, that was only the beginning. It began with a single sentence. A cold, carefully crafted sentence tucked inside an early morning palace communique. A sentence so subtle that most people would have skimmed past it. Yet for those who understood the power games, the family rifts, and the decades of tension simmering beneath the royal facade, that one sentence might as well have been a thunderclap across British history. Under the guidance and leadership of the Prince of Wales, the monarchy will enter a new operational phase effective immediately. There it was. Innocent to the untrained eye, explosive to anyone who knew the truth. The Prince of Wales. Operational phase. Effective immediately. In royal language, those words are not suggestions. They are structural changes. They are decisions. Declarations. Shifts in power. And inside Buckingham Palace, the staff knew it the moment they read it. You could almost feel the walls react. Corridors that were usually hushed and reverent suddenly hummed with whispers. Advisors exchanged looks, some stunned, some relieved. Senior aides paused mid-step, rereading the message, weighing the implications. Because this wasn't simply an announcement. It was a signal, one that suggested the monarchy was not merely transitioning. It was realigning. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's step into that moment more slowly, more vividly. Picture this. It's 7:12 a.m. in London. The palace is awake but quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, as though the building itself can sense that something monumental is about to unfold. A few security officers are switching shifts. Light filters through centuries-old windows. A distant kettle whistles in one of the staff kitchens. The ordinary rhythm of palace life ticks forward. Then the first phone buzzes. A senior communications aide looks down. He reads the alert. His breath catches. 2 floors above him, another notification goes off. Then another. Then another. Within 90 seconds, every high-ranking figure inside the royal household has received the same internal message. A press release draft, accompanied by a private note stating that King Charles has approved a temporary restructuring of duties under the direction of Prince William. Temporary. That word alone sent eyebrows shooting upward. Temporary in royal terms can mean anything from 3 weeks to permanent until someone dies. But that wasn't the part that shook everyone. It was the phrase, under the guidance and leadership of the Prince of Wales. Not in coordination with. Not in support of. Not in partnership with. Leadership. That word does not get used lightly. Not for William. Not while Charles is still alive. Not in normal circumstances. So why now? Why this phrasing? Why this urgency? And why deliver it before dawn, both in London and, crucially, before midnight in California? Because whether people want to admit it or not, this announcement had a target audience. Harry. And the palace knew exactly what it was doing. But let's not forget one important detail. Announcements like these must be deliberate and watertight. Everything must be approved by multiple departments. Everything must pass through legal review. Everything is weighed, measured, and polished until it gleams with intention. Which means this was not rushed. It was planned. Every comma, every verb, every shift in power, all of it was intentional. And by using William's title, not his name, not a vague reference, but his formal, powerful title, the palace was making something brutally clear. William is no longer just the future king. He is the leader now. This was the moment the monarchy quietly transitioned from Charles's symbolic reign to William's functional reign. But here's the detail that most of the public doesn't know. The announcement they saw wasn't the announcement the royals saw. The public statement was stripped down, softened, and neutral. The private communiqué contained several additional paragraphs outlining specific responsibilities, structural changes, and a forthcoming rollout of what insiders called the streamlining. A word that sent chills through the royal watchers. Streamlining means reducing roles, reducing titles, reducing relevance. And when you have a family member who has willingly stepped away, streamlining becomes a convenient tool. Now imagine, for a moment, being inside the palace war room the night before this message went out. A large table, folders marked confidential, advisors debating the language, some pushing for boldness, others warning about backlash. And somewhere in the background, a clock ticking, because once the king approved it, there would be no turning back. And deep down, each advisor knew what this announcement would trigger. They knew Harry's reaction would be volcanic. They knew Meghan would see this as a direct challenge. They knew the press would pounce. But they also knew something else. They could no longer afford to wait. Because the monarchy had reached a breaking point. A point where Harry and Meghan's media attacks had created global skepticism. A point where Charles's health rumors left succession questions hanging in the air. A point where public trust had begun to erode in ways the institution considers dangerous. And in moments like that, they don't choose the loudest member of the family. They choose the most stable, the most strategic, the one the public trusts. And that wasn't Harry. So the palace made its move. Now, while the palace was bracing for the internal reaction, something else was happening across the country. Media outlets were waking up. Journalists were scanning their emails. Newsrooms began to murmur. Producer calls were being scheduled. Graphics teams pulled up the royal announcement templates. And by 8 a.m., the British public was already speculating. Why William? Why now? What does this mean? Where does Harry fit in? Or more accurately, does Harry fit in at all? But Harry didn't wait for the public reaction. He didn't even wait for the American morning shows to pick it up. He reacted immediately. and we will get to that explosive reaction in the next chapter. For now, let's stay focused on what this announcement did inside palace walls. Because the staff knew instantly that this was the most important royal message since Queen Elizabeth's final Jubilee celebrations. Not because it changed titles, but because it changed direction. The monarchy had been drifting for years, through scandals, crises, family divisions, political controversies, but this was the first time in a long time that Buckingham Palace said, through formal wording, "We're taking control." And who better to steady the monarchy than William, the man who has consistently scored the highest public approval ratings, maintained the strongest international reception, and avoided the leaks and emotional volatility that have plagued the Sussexes. But let me ask you something. What happens when an institution chooses one brother and sideline the other? What happens when the royal machine, with all its history and influence, puts its weight behind one man and none behind the other? What happens when power shifts from quiet inheritance to active leadership? Those questions aren't rhetorical. They're the very reason this story is gripping the world. Because what Buckingham Palace did that morning wasn't just symbolic. It wasn't a gesture. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a transfer of power, responsibility, authority, and future. And when you transfer power, someone loses it. Which brings us back to Harry, a prince who has spent 4 years tearing down the institution and is now terrified it no longer cares. But here's the twist. Here's the part almost no one saw coming. Here's what makes this announcement so much more explosive than a simple restructuring. There was one line in the internal document, one line the palace intentionally removed before the public version went out. One sentence that changed the meaning of the entire announcement. One sentence that explained the urgency and Harry's panic. One sentence that, according to insiders, no one outside the inner circle was ever meant to read. And when Harry saw that line, his world cracked open. You'll see that line soon, very soon, but not yet. Because before we reveal it, we need to explore Harry's reaction as it unfolded behind Montecito's closed gates. And trust me, it was far worse than anyone expected. This announcement didn't just shake the palace. It pushed Harry to the edge. And what he did next sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. The scream came first. Before the panic. Before the frantic pacing. Before the accusations, the calls, the broken silence inside that California mansion. It came like a crack in the air. Sharp, guttural, unfiltered. The kind of sound a man makes when he realizes something has slipped permanently out of his control. Neighbors would later describe it as a terrified shout, and a sound of someone losing everything at once. One claimed it startled her enough to check if an accident had happened outside. Another thought it was a fight. But those who know Harry insist it wasn't anger. It was shock. And that shock detonated inside Montecito just seconds after he opened Buckingham Palace's message announcing the new monarchy structure. Picture it. Harry, barefoot on the kitchen tiles, coffee still half poured, early morning lights spilling through the windows. The house is quiet in that hollow, peaceful way only massive homes can be at dawn. Meghan isn't in the room yet. The kids are asleep. Even the dogs aren't moving. Harry scrolls. He reads the first sentence, then the second. His eyebrows pull together. His jaw tightens. He scrolls again, rereads the same line. And then, the scream. Not a yell out of frustration. Not a shout thrown in anger. A scream ripped from the center of a man who suddenly sees the walls closing in. And that single sound jolts the entire household awake. Meghan appears within seconds, rushing in from the hallway, still in a robe, hair unbrushed, eyes widening when she sees him clutching the phone so tightly his knuckles have turned white. "What happened?" she asks. No answer. Harry just mutters, "No, no, no. They can't, they wouldn't, this isn't real." Then he scrolls again, reads again, and shakes his head as if trying to dislodge a nightmare that found its way into daylight. Meghan steps closer. "What did they say?" Harry finally turns the screen toward her. Meghan scans the announcement. Her expression changes, not shock like his, but calculation. A tightening of the lips, a narrowing of the eyes. She reads the phrase, "under the guidance and leadership of the Prince of Wales." Her shoulders stiffen. Then she reads the details Harry hadn't even processed yet. The restructuring of duties, the formal recognition of William's leadership, the multiple layers of authority being centralized under his oversight. Meghan exhales, slow and controlled. But that control is exactly what Harry no longer has. He starts pacing. Fast. Chaotic. The kind of pacing you see in someone trying to outrun reality. He mutters to himself, shaking his head, pulling at his hair, stopping to read the message again as if hoping it might change. They're doing this to humiliate me, he snaps. They're doing this to erase me. They've been planning this for months, behind my back. But here's the detail that truly set him off, and this is important. The announcement wasn't sent to him first. It wasn't even sent personally. It arrived through the standard royal distribution list, the same one used for event scheduling, protocol reminders, and holiday greetings. To Harry, that wasn't just disrespect. It was a message. A cold, unmistakable message. You are not part of this conversation. And that realization shook him more than the announcement itself. Have you ever seen someone who has spent years claiming they don't need something suddenly shatter when they realize that thing is now moving on without them? It's a special kind of panic, a panic rooted not in loss, but in irrelevance. That was the exact emotion vibrating through Harry's voice as he started ranting. They can't do this without me. I'm the son. I'm still the son. They're freezing me out because of the book. It's William. He pushed for this. He wants to punish me. The contradictions poured out one after the other. 1 second he was furious. The next, defensive. The next, victimized. The next, combative. It was emotional whiplash. And Meghan watched it all unfold with an expression that was half concern, half strategic assessment. Because Meghan is not someone who responds impulsively. She observes, she analyzes, she calculates next steps. But in that moment, even she didn't know how to contain the meltdown. Harry slammed the message onto the counter. He grabbed his phone, typed something, deleted it, typed again, deleted again. It was like watching a storm flicker inside a small room. Nowhere to go, nothing to break except himself. Finally, he grabbed the phone again and said through clenched teeth, I'm calling them. Meghan stepped forward quickly. Harry, don't. Not yet. But it was too late. He had already dialed. And here's where the story tightens. Here's where things start spiraling. Here's where emotions turn into consequences. The first call wasn't answered. He tried again, then again. No response. And that silence? That hurt more than the announcement. Because silence was the exact thing Harry had always accused the palace of using to punish him. And now they were doing it again. Or at least, that's how he saw it. Meghan placed a hand on his arm, trying to steady him. Think. Just breathe for a second. But breathing was not an option for him. He dialed again. This time not a person, but an office line. A direct number inside Buckingham Palace that he still had access to. When they answered, Harry didn't even wait for introductions. What the hell is going on? He demanded. Who authorized this? Why wasn't I informed? Why wasn't I consulted? The aide on the other end tried to remain calm, professional, neutral. Sir, the palace will be issuing a public version. I don't care about the public version. Harry snapped. I want to know why you're placing everything under William. The aide's pause lasted too long. Harry knew that pause. It was the palace pause, the one staff used when they didn't want to risk saying something that might be quoted later. Harry's breathing grew louder, heavier. Tell me what this means. Tell me right now. Sir, all communications regarding the restructuring must come from His Majesty's office. That sentence was fuel on the fire. His Majesty's office. Harry exploded. So William wrote it. William arranged it. William pushed it through, and now you're hiding behind my father. Meghan, whispering urgently, tried to calm him. Harry, stop. You're giving them too much emotion. Think. But Harry wasn't thinking. He was spiraling. He slammed the phone down so hard the screen briefly flashed. He started pacing again, muttering, replaying every insult, every grudge, every bitter memory. You could practically see the years of resentment piling up like wet logs inside a growing fire. And then came the next emotional spike, blame. They knew exactly what they were doing, Harry said, voice rising again. They wanted me to see it. They wanted to hurt me. They wanted to humiliate me. Harry, Meghan tried again. You have to be strategic. No, he said sharply. No, this isn't strategy. This is war. And that word hung in the room. War. A war between brothers. A war between a runaway prince and an ancient institution. A war between a man who left the monarchy and a monarchy that finally decided to leave him behind. But here's what makes this moment even deeper. Harry didn't scream because of envy. He didn't scream because William was rising. He didn't even scream because of the shift in duties. He screamed because the announcement erased his leverage. In every argument, every interview, every documentary, every memoir paragraph, Harry positioned himself as the insider, the one in the know, the one who understood the institution's inner workings, the one whose voice mattered. But this announcement, this carefully crafted, impeccably timed message, told him in no uncertain terms, your voice doesn't matter anymore. And once a man realizes his influence is gone, panic becomes inevitable. Now, throughout this meltdown, Meghan remained surprisingly composed. She wasn't calm, but she was controlled. Watching, thinking, already planning the narrative shift, already calculating how to spin this in their favor. But the truth is, there are moments even Meghan cannot soften. And this was one of them. Because no matter how many public appearances, podcast episodes, or documentary monologues they produce, they still crave royal relevance. Without it, their brand collapses. And this announcement was the first major sign that the palace was pulling the plug on that relevance for good. Harry eventually stopped pacing. He put his hands on the counter, lowered his head, and whispered, barely audible, "They've cut me out, Meg." They finally did it. Meghan didn't answer, because deep down, she knew the palace had been preparing for this for months. The internal shifts, the increasing senior role William has taken, the subtle messaging, the tightening of royal communications. All the signs were there, but Harry wasn't ready to see them. Not until today. Not until this. Not until the moment reality hit him all at once. But as intense as that moment was, what came next was even more shocking. Because Harry didn't just react emotionally. He reacted decisively. He reached for his phone again, and this time, he wasn't calling an aide. He wasn't calling a palace office. He wasn't even calling Charles. He called someone else. Someone whose involvement would blow the entire situation open. And the moment that call connected, the real battle began. But what came next would change everything. And Harry had no idea how deep this would go. The moment the palace email hit Montecito like a grenade, something equally powerful, but far quieter, was happening on the other side of the world. A private meeting, a sealed room, a collection of the most influential royal minds sitting around a polished table beneath a towering portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. This was not a meeting scheduled in panic. It wasn't reactionary. It wasn't emotional. It was strategic, and it had been in motion long before Harry ever saw the email. But here's the part almost no one knows. The meeting wasn't called by King Charles. It was called by Prince William. And that single detail flips this entire story. Because publicly, William is seen as the calm one, the steady one, the diplomatic one who never makes sudden moves. But privately, behind closed doors, there is a version of William the public almost never sees. The version who understands that the survival of the monarchy sometimes depends on doing the one thing the institution has historically avoided. Choosing strength over sentiment. And that is exactly what this meeting was about. So let's step inside that room. Imagine a long, solid oak table. Papers stacked neatly at each seat. The soft hum of old radiators. Heavy velvet curtains drawn halfway, blocking the morning glare. At the head of the table sits William. Shoulders squared, expression calm but unreadable. To his right, senior members of the Privy Council. To his left, top palace advisors, constitutional experts, and two key communication strategists. No cameras, no notes allowed to leave, no leaks tolerated. This was the meeting where William revealed what insiders now call the new monarchy blueprint. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it was revolutionary in its precision. William opened the meeting with a short statement. A statement so clear, so direct, that one aide later described it as the moment we realized the monarchy was shifting from ceremonial to operational necessity. He said, "The institution cannot survive uncertainty. It must adapt, and it must do so now." Simple, measured, unemotional. But the weight of those words was enormous, because uncertainty had become the monarchy's greatest weakness. Between health rumors, public distrust, the Sussex chaos, economic pressure, media scrutiny, and political tension, the royal machine was losing stability. And stability is the monarchy's oxygen. So William didn't come into the meeting to discuss the future. He came with the future already in his hands. He unfolded a document, printed, annotated, bookmarked, and placed it in the center of the table. It wasn't long. It wasn't complicated. But the simplicity was the threat. Because simple plans have clarity. Simple plans eliminate loopholes. Simple plans cut through emotional hesitation. This was William's plan. Now, what was in this blueprint? Here's the shocking part. It wasn't about making William king prematurely. It wasn't about pushing Charles aside. And it definitely wasn't about punishing Harry. It was about securing the monarchy's survival through intentional leadership. William's blueprint focused on 4 pillars. Centralized leadership under one figure. Not multiple working royals. Not a scattered structure. One leader to oversee operations, communication, diplomacy, and crisis management. Streamlined roles based on competency, stability, and public trust. Translation: people who cause instability would no longer represent the crown. Rebuilding public confidence through transparency and predictability. Preparing for a seamless transition when the time comes. Not if, when. Now, imagine the faces around the table as William presented this. Some nodded. Some hesitated. Some took slow breaths, aware of the magnitude of what they were hearing. Because William wasn't just suggesting a stronger role. He was assuming it. And the advisors knew it. But here's the detail that really underscores the gravity of this moment. William didn't speak about Harry once. Not once. Not a mention. Not a reference. Not an implication. Because Harry is no longer part of William's equation. He's not an asset. He's not a threat. He's a non-factor. And that is exactly what infuriated Harry when he saw the announcement. Because the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And for the first time, William was signaling institutional indifference toward his brother. Now let's dig deeper into the meeting. Once William finished outlining the 4 pillars, the advisors moved into discussion mode. Questions were raised about public reaction, procedural details, constitutional implications. The team debated wording, legal phrasing, timing. But then came the pivotal moment. William stood, walked toward the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, and said something that changed the entire tone of the room. He said, "My grandmother always acted from duty, not emotion." This is the moment we return to that. That line hit everyone in the room differently. For some, it was a rallying call. For others, a thinly veiled rebuke of what the institution had tolerated. For a few, it was both inspiring and sobering. Because invoking Queen Elizabeth in a strategic meeting is not something done lightly. And William knew exactly what he was doing. He was positioning himself not just as the next in line, but as the rightful successor to her leadership style. A return to discipline. A return to calm authority. A return to stability. Not chaos. Not emotion. Not scandal-driven decision-making. One aide wrote in his private notes later, "In that moment, William became the center of the monarchy." And here's something even more revealing. There was one empty chair at the table. Not by accident. Not symbolic. Practical. Reserved for someone who was invited, but did not attend. That someone, King Charles. Not because he was uninvolved. Not because he objected. But because, for the first time, Charles allowed William to direct a major institutional meeting without supervision. Charles approved the blueprint, but William led it. And that was the moment advisors understood. The shift had already begun. Now, let's talk about the tension beneath all this. Because while the palace publicly projects unity, internally there have been growing concerns about Charles's health, stamina, and ability to manage the intense workload that comes with modern monarchy expectations. These concerns aren't scandalous, they're realistic. Charles is in his 70s. He has endured stress, grief, and the endless scrutiny that comes with the crown. And William has watched all of it up close. William wasn't stepping up to overthrow anyone. He was stepping up because someone had to, and the advisors knew it. One asked William directly during the meeting, "Are you prepared for the responsibility this places on you?" William didn't hesitate. Yes. Not a smile. Not a boast. Not a dramatic pause. Just a firm, steady yes. Because William wasn't just prepared. He had been waiting for the chance to protect something bigger than himself. Now, here's the twist. Because every chapter has one. The meeting wasn't just about planning the future. It was about timing. And the timing was chosen for a very specific reason. The palace received intelligence, credible intelligence, that Harry and Meghan were preparing a new media project targeting the monarchy. Not a book, not a documentary, something different, something more dangerous. A combined investigative exposé and political commentary series designed to question not just the monarchy's methods, but its legitimacy. And the palace knew that releasing William's blueprint after such a series would make the monarchy look weak and defensive. So they acted first, preemptively, strategically, decisively. And that is the moment everything began to align. Now, as the meeting entered its final stage, advisors shifted to the most sensitive topic of all. How would the public interpret this restructuring? Would it look like Charles was stepping back due to health? Would it appear as though William was taking over early? Would it spark controversy? Would it ignite conspiracy theories? Yes, 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 and yes. But William was unfazed. He said, "The monarchy is not built on avoiding controversy. It is built on enduring it." That line will likely be quoted in history books one day, because it shows exactly why the palace chose him. After the meeting concluded, the advisors voted unanimously on the rollout strategy. The internal version, the one with the real language, would be sent first. The public version would follow hours later, after softening, editing, and removing anything inflammatory. But here's the detail only a few insiders know. William chose the time the message would be sent. Why does that matter? Because the timing ensured Harry would receive the announcement late at night, when emotional reactions are more volatile. Some say William was being strategic. Others say he was being cold. But whichever one you believe, one thing is certain. It worked. Because Harry's meltdown began before the public statement even hit the media. And William knew it would. Not because he wanted Harry to suffer. Not because he wanted revenge. But because Harry's reaction was irrelevant to the future William was trying to protect. The monarchy. After the meeting ended, William lingered in the room for a moment. Looking up at the portrait of his grandmother, he didn't smile. He didn't sigh. He didn't show any emotion. He simply stood there, as if absorbing the weight of the crown that was inching closer to him. Then he turned, walked out of the room, and instructed his team to proceed. But here's where the chapter takes its final turn, the one that will shape the rest of this story. Because William didn't just approve the message. He chose someone unexpected to deliver it. Someone Harry never imagined would be involved. Someone who carries a specific significance. Someone whose involvement would cut deeper than any announcement could. And when Harry found out who delivered the message to advisors and senior members of the institution, that was the moment everything inside Montecito went from panic to fury. But who was that person? And why did their involvement ignite Harry like gasoline meeting fire? What came next would escalate the crisis into something far more personal. And no one saw it coming. The truth hit the palace long before it hit the public. Before the headlines. Before the whispers. Before the speculation about succession or royal turmoil. It began inside Buckingham Palace. In the private corridors, the restricted wings, the back offices where senior aides have learned to read the mood of kings by the slightest changes in posture, tone, or hesitation. And what they saw, what they heard, what they sensed long before the world ever knew, was that King Charles was slipping, not collapsing, not failing dramatically, not fading in a way the tabloids could sensationalize overnight. No, Charles's decline was subtle, a fatigue he tried to brush off, a fragility in his voice during briefings, a tendency to take longer pauses when reading reports, a reluctance to appear in public when he didn't feel at his best, the kind of shift a family notices before outsiders do, the kind of shift a monarchy fears. Because monarchies do not run on sentiment. They run on strength. And inside those palace walls, strength was quietly transitioning from a 70-something king to a 40-something heir. But before we go deeper into that shift, let's start with the moment that changed everything. The moment the king made a decision that even his closest aides couldn't believe he accepted without argument. Early one morning, weeks before the big announcement, King Charles held a private meeting in Clarence House with two of his most trusted advisors. The meeting was not scheduled on the official calendar. The doors were closed, curtains drawn, phones surrendered, staff dismissed. The king asked only one question. Is the institution stable? It was such a simple question, but one with seismic implications. One advisor hesitated, too long. The other finally answered, Your Majesty, stability requires clarity. The The king looked down, pressed his fingertips together, took a slow breath. And clarity, he asked quietly, requires what? The advisor's response altered the course of royal history. Consistency of leadership. Those 4 words are what set into motion everything that followed. The restructuring, the shift of duties, the elevation of William, and the ripple effects that eventually sent Harry spiraling in California. Because Charles, for all his pride, for all his decades waiting for the crown, for all his intention to modernize the monarchy, understood something deeply uncomfortable. He wasn't strong enough anymore. Not to lead the monarchy through a crisis. Not to fight the media onslaught. Not to withstand the attention of 2 rebellious royals tearing at the institution. Not to shoulder the physical and emotional demands of running the crown. And certainly not to do all of that while battling his own private health concerns. So he did something no one expected. He handed over his power, quietly. Not ceremonially. Not dramatically. Not with a televised speech or a public gesture, but through a series of strategic approvals that allowed William to step into the role of de facto leader while Charles remained the symbolic monarch. A shadow transfer of power, a shift so quiet that even high-ranking staff realized what was happening only after it was already done. But why so quietly? Why not announce a regency or a formal handover? Because Charles feared weakness would overshadow him. He feared comparisons to past monarchs who struggled. He feared the narrative that he waited 70 years for a throne he was unable to hold. He feared being defined by frailty rather than legacy. So he allowed the transition to happen backstage, away from prying eyes, away from speculation, away from political consequences. William would lead. Charles would remain king. And no one outside the palace needed to know. At least, not yet. But here's the twist. And this is something even many insiders don't fully understand. The decline wasn't just physical. It was emotional. Charles had experienced something few people on Earth can truly comprehend. The loss of his mother, the monarch who defined an entire century, followed almost immediately by the crushing responsibility of succeeding her. Grief and duty collided, and Charles, despite his decades of preparation, felt the weight in a way he never anticipated. One aide recalled a haunting moment during the early days of his reign. Charles walked through the gallery of past monarchs, stopped at the portrait of Queen Victoria, stared at it in silence, and whispered, "It's too much weight, too much pressure, too much expectation. A man can carry a crown, but grief makes everything heavier." And while Charles tried to maintain the image of strength, he increasingly leaned on William, not just as a son, but as a stabilizing force. Now here's where the story gets even more complicated. Because while Charles's trust in William grew, his trust in Harry evaporated. Not slowly, not gradually, not reluctantly, but sharply, ripped away by the betrayal Charles felt with Spare, ripped away by the interviews, ripped away by Harry's public accusations about the family, the institution, the parenting, the protection, the silence, ripped away by the deep, irreversible wound of Harry framing Charles as emotionally negligent. Those wounds never healed. They never even scabbed over. And so, as Charles became increasingly dependent on one son, he became increasingly distant from the other. Harry sensed this, of course, but he convinced himself that Charles's distance was engineered by William, that the palace was manipulating the king, that William was controlling the narrative. Harry didn't understand, because he didn't want to understand, that Charles's withdrawal had nothing to do with palace manipulation. It had everything to do with heartbreak. And in the quiet hours of the night, Charles admitted something devastating to a close confidant. "I lost my mother, and I lost my son." That sentence alone explains the silent transfer of power, because a king who feels emotionally fractured cannot project unity, and a monarchy that appears divided cannot survive. So Charles did the only thing he could do in that moment. He chose the son who could carry the institution. He chose the son who would not break under pressure. He chose the son who would protect the crown, even at great personal cost. He chose William. Now, let's bring this into sharper focus. The palace's decision to centralize leadership under William was not just strategic. It was protective. Protective of Charles's dignity. Protective of William's future. Protective of the monarchy's strength. Protective of the crown's global reputation. And protective of something else. The royal line of succession. Because Charles knew that the crown would not pass to Harry's children. It would not pass to Archie. It would not pass to Lilibet. Harry's choices made that impossible. Too much controversy. Too much unpredictability. Too much detachment from royal life. And so the palace had to formalize, quietly but unmistakably, that the future sits on William's shoulders. Which brings us to the email. The email that detonated Harry. The email that caused the scream. The email that symbolized for the first time, publicly, that William wasn't just heir. He was leader. And now let's zoom into one moment. The most symbolic moment of all. On the morning of the announcement, King Charles was in his private study at Sandringham. He held a copy of the internal communique. His hands trembled slightly as he read the words giving William operational leadership. He looked out the window, toward the trees swaying in the winter wind. He closed his eyes and whispered something that would stay with the aide who overheard it for the rest of his life. It's his time now. That was it. Not a royal proclamation. Not a ceremonial passing of authority. But the quiet admission of a man who knew that the world he inherited was now the world he needed to let go of. And when he placed the paper down, he didn't touch it again. He didn't need to. The decision was made. The monarchy was shifting, and Harry would be the last to know. But not the last to react. Because Harry, realizing the shift was real, would do something desperate, emotional, and utterly unpredictable, forcing William to take action he never wanted to take. Because what came next was not just a family conflict. It was the moment Harry crossed a line that even Meghan was not prepared for, and the fallout would explode across every royal office in the United Kingdom. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It didn't happen overnight. No one wakes up one morning, looks at Prince Harry, and says, "There he is, the traitor." No, the royal family is too old, too slow-moving, too steeped in tradition to slap labels carelessly. Harry earned that title, piece by piece, decision by decision, interview by interview, leak by leak. And by the time Buckingham Palace released the announcement that sent Harry screaming through the Montecito morning air, the label was already carved into the marble halls of the institution. Not publicly, not formally, but quietly, in the hearts and minds of those who worked closest to the crown. But if you ask palace insiders when the shift truly began, when the warm, beloved, cheeky Prince Harry became the traitor, they'll point to one moment that changed everything. And it wasn't the Oprah interview. It wasn't Spare. It wasn't the Netflix series. It was something smaller, something pettier, something far more personal. It happened during a private conversation, one the public never saw, one that didn't make headlines. A conversation between Harry and a senior palace aide, a man who had served Queen Elizabeth II for nearly 3 decades. This aide, loyal to a fault, had approached Harry with a message of concern during one of his final visits to the UK before stepping back. "Your grandmother is worried." That's all he said. A simple sentence. A gentle plea. A subtle reminder that actions have consequences. Harry didn't respond with compassion. He didn't soften. He didn't reflect. He didn't say he'd talk to the Queen. He snapped. She should be more worried about the people controlling her. And to palace staff, especially those who adored the late Queen like a second mother. That sentence was an unforgivable break. It was the moment the institution realized Harry was no longer acting impulsively. He was acting destructively. And destruction inside the monarchy is treason, not legally, but symbolically. So when the palace began quietly removing Harry from the center of operations, it wasn't because he stepped back. It was because he stepped against them. But let's go deeper, because the traitor label didn't come from one sentence alone. It came from a pattern the palace had studied, documented, and, despite their silence, never forgotten. The first fracture came with Meghan's arrival, not because of who she was, but because of what Harry became once she entered his life. He became defensive, suspicious, convinced the institution was out to sabotage their marriage. Palace aides recall that Harry started interpreting innocent protocols as deliberate slights. Then came the wedding. Remember that moment during the ceremony when Harry shot a sharp look toward the choir? Most people thought he was simply overwhelmed. But palace insiders say Harry believed something off-script happened, despite everyone else insisting nothing unusual occurred. That was the moment they realized paranoia was creeping in. Then came the arguments with William, The heated conversations behind closed doors, the emotional outbursts during public engagements. Harry began accusing aides of withholding information, of feeding tabloids, of disrespecting Meghan, of protecting the wrong people. Every grievance became a theory. Every theory became a conflict. Every conflict became fuel. And the palace watched in silence as one of their brightest stars dimmed into someone they barely recognized. But the real turning point, was something far darker. It came when Harry started leaking. Not to the press directly, not in explosive interviews, but quietly, through intermediaries. Private conversations, internal disagreements, confidential scheduling details, behind-the-scenes staff conflicts, distorted versions of disputes. Bits and pieces of palace life that were never supposed to leave the halls suddenly appeared in articles, documentaries, podcasts, social media threads, and commentaries. And the pattern always pointed back to Harry. To the palace, that wasn't disloyalty. It was treason. Because the monarchy's survival depends on one sacred rule. What happens inside stays inside. Break that rule, and you break the foundation. Harry didn't just break it. He shattered it. Now let's talk about the real damage. The betrayal that cemented the traitor label in ways no one could walk back. It wasn't the Oprah interview. It wasn't Spare. It wasn't the Netflix documentary. It was the internal memo. Few people know about it. Even fewer have seen it. And none of them will ever publicly admit it exists. But palace sources swear by it. An internal report prepared by a security and communications task force outlining the leaks believed to have come from Harry's side. It wasn't written to punish him. It wasn't written to shame him. It was written because they needed to assess risk. Harry wasn't just unpredictable anymore. He was a liability. And that word, liability, is deadly inside palace walls. Once a working royal becomes a liability, protocols change. Access is restricted. Information is limited. Briefings become shorter. Communications become filtered. And when you add public bitterness into the mix, the institution has to take action. That's why when Harry left the UK, his official palace email was deactivated faster than the public realized. That's why his access to confidential family communications was quietly reduced. That's why he stopped being included in operational planning even before the formal stepping back announcement. The palace didn't wait for Harry to leave. They prepared for it. But here's the heartbreaking part. The Queen saw it coming. She loved Harry deeply. She trusted him. She defended him. But even she recognized that something inside him had shifted, something she could not control, soothe, or reverse. In one of her last private reflections about him, shared only with a longtime lady-in-waiting, she reportedly said, "I don't know what's happened to my grandson, but he's not the boy I raised." That sentence devastated palace staff when they learned of it after her passing. Because if the Queen herself could sense Harry drifting into hostility, then what hope did anyone else have of bringing him back? Which brings us to the final reason Harry was labeled the traitor. The one that rocked even the most stoic palace insiders. He betrayed his brother, William, the brother who once followed him everywhere, who once confided in him late at night about anxiety, duty, pressure, expectations. The brother who wanted them to rule together someday, not through titles, but through unity. And Harry destroyed that, not through distance, but through accusation. He didn't just expose disagreements. He didn't just reveal private conversations. He painted William, the future king, as violent, unstable, cold, privileged, and emotionally incompetent. That crossed a line. Because criticizing the monarchy is one thing. Criticizing the next king is another. To the palace, Harry didn't just break trust. He weakened the future. And that is something a 1,000-year-old institution cannot forgive. Now let's tie all this back to the announcement in Chapter 1. When Harry opened that email, the one placing the monarchy under William's leadership, he didn't just see a shift in roles. He saw a verdict. He saw confirmation of what the palace had been feeling about him for years. He wasn't one of them anymore. He wasn't trusted. He wasn't respected. He wasn't considered stable, loyal, or reliable. He wasn't even considered necessary. He was a threat, a liability, a traitor to the internal code that holds the monarchy together. And that's what triggered the scream. Not the sentence about William. Not the restructuring. Not the timing. It was the quiet, unspoken truth behind the announcement. The palace didn't want him back. Not now. Not ever. Not as long as William was leading. And if that wasn't enough to set Harry off, the next development was even worse. Because just hours after the meltdown in Montecito, a high-ranking palace source leaked a detail to a reporter, a detail no one expected, and one that poured gasoline on Harry's emotional fire. Within the palace, staff were now referring to Harry informally as the outsider. But Harry heard a different version. He heard a phrase far harsher, far more personal. The traitor. And that's when Harry decided to retaliate, not verbally, not emotionally, but strategically. He made a decision that crossed the final line, forcing William to intervene personally. But what Harry did next would push the situation into dangerous territory, and no one was prepared for how far he'd go. It began as a whisper, a rumor, a small leak that seemed too outrageous to be real, until multiple sources confirmed it, one after another, like dominoes falling in perfect, terrifying alignment. There's a recording. Those were the words that shook Buckingham Palace and Montecito alike. Not an interview, not a voicemail, not a clipped audio taken out of context. A full recording. Harry's voice, unfiltered, unrestrained, unprotected. And what he said in that recording sent the palace into a silent panic. The kind of panic that forces advisors to gather at dawn, behind closed doors, speaking in voices so low even the tapestries on the walls seemed to lean in to listen. But let's start at the beginning. Because the recording didn't surface publicly. It wasn't leaked to the press. It didn't appear in a tabloid with a sensational headline. It stayed inside the palace. Hidden, protected, studied. And the only reason we know it existed is because Harry's reaction made it impossible to keep contained. But before we get into that explosion, let's go back to the moment the recording was made, because that moment reveals everything. Not just about Harry's unraveling, but about the palace's decision to strip him from the center of royal operations permanently. The recording happened months before the restructuring announcement, before the emails, before the scream, before the meltdown. It happened during a tense phone call between Harry and a senior royal aide, a man known for his discretion, loyalty, and almost military-like adherence to protocol. This wasn't a casual staff member, not someone in communications, not someone easily manipulated or intimidated. This was a gatekeeper, one of the few remaining figures in the monarchy who had served both Queen Elizabeth II and King Charles with unwavering commitment. And Harry called him with a purpose. Harry wanted access. Access to something the palace had quietly restricted after Spare. No one knows exactly what he asked for: documents, schedules, briefings, security protocols, or something more sensitive. But what we do know is that his request was denied. Politely, professionally, unemotionally. This information is available only to senior working members of the royal family, the aide said. And that's when the tone shifted. That's when Harry snapped. Not loudly, at first. Not violently. But with a sharpness that cut deeper than shouting ever could. So I'm not family anymore, then? The aide tried to de-escalate, but Harry wasn't hearing it. I was born into this family, he continued. I didn't choose this life. I didn't ask for this role. And now you're telling me I don't have access to my own family's affairs. Silence. A silence that carried decades of tension. Then Harry's voice, rising. You're shutting me out deliberately. All of you. And you know exactly why. Because I told the truth. The aide attempted to steer the conversation back to procedure. Harry wasn't interested. You think I don't know what's going on? He snapped. William's behind this. He's always been behind this. He's trying to control the narrative. He's trying to make me look unstable. But you listened to me carefully. And then he said it. The line that would define the recording. The line that made the aide decide to preserve the conversation. The line that made palace staff realize Harry was no longer just emotional. He was dangerous. You tell him I will burn the whole thing down if I have to. Those words. Calm. Measured. Deadly. Not shouted. Not impulsive. Not a slip of the tongue. A promise. A threat. A declaration of war. The aide froze. Because that sentence, from any other person, could be brushed off. But from a prince? From a man with access to decades of royal history, secrets, vulnerabilities, and private communications? That sentence was catastrophic. And that is the exact moment the aide made a decision. He recorded the rest of the call. Not illegally, not secretly, but within palace guidelines allowing recording of hostile or threatening communications from members of the royal family for internal security documentation. Few people know this rule exists, but it does. And that day, it saved the monarchy from a far bigger disaster. Because what Harry said next was worse. Much worse. You think I don't have receipts? He continued. You think I don't have names? Incidents? Dates? You think I won't say everything if you keep pushing me out? The aide asked him to clarify. Harry did.